I was deployed to a small forward operating base in northern Alaska during the winter of 2012. It wasn't a combat zone in the traditional sense, but the cold and isolation made every day feel like a fight. The outpost, which we just called FOB Frost, was positioned near the Arctic Circle, surrounded by endless stretches of snow and ice. My unit was small, about 20 of us, mostly infantry with a handful of support staff, and we were responsible for monitoring a stretch of terrain along the border. The work itself was simple: rotate on guard, check sensors, maintain equipment, and report any anomalies. Simple on paper. The first few weeks were normal, if you could call living in sub-zero temperatures normal. We settled into routine. We slept in shifts, ate frozen rations that were barely edible, and huddled inside the command building when the wind whipped across the tundra. Nights were the worst. The sun barely rose, and when it did, it barely lit anything before disappearing again. The cold was constant, gnawing at your skin and making even the smallest movements exhausting. It started one night during my watch. I was stationed at a small observation tower on the perimeter of the outpost. From there, I had a clear view of the snow-covered terrain in every direction. The radios were quiet. The generators hummed in the distance, and the only sound was the wind. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a mirage, just the frost playing tricks on my eyes. A figure was walking along the tree line, moving steadily but with no identifiable features. No snowmobile tracks, no footprints leading up to it, just the outline of a man trudging through knee-deep snow. I reported it over the radio immediately, thinking it was one of our patrols that had gotten lost. The response came back that no patrols were out. That was impossible. We accounted for everyone before leaving the building, and the logs confirmed it. I didn't want to sound paranoid, so I stayed on watch, keeping my eyes on the figure. But when I tried to use my night binoculars, it was gone. 1 second, there it was, moving toward the tree line, and the next, nothing. I shrugged it off, assuming it was fatigue, stress, or hallucination from the cold. The next day, I mentioned it to one of the more experienced soldiers, a guy named Jackson. He didn't laugh or brush it off. He just stared at me for a moment, then said, "You'll get used to seeing things up here. Sometimes people or animals appear that shouldn't be." I didn't like that answer. The following week, more strange things happened. Equipment would be moved slightly out of place, supplies would disappear from storage, and sensors would trigger for no reason. The worst part was the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I stepped outside, it was like something was just beyond the range of my vision, always moving, always waiting. At night, the other soldiers began whispering about seeing figures in the snow, shadows that weren't ours, even though everyone was accounted for. One night, I decided to stay in the tower through the entire shift, hoping to catch whatever it was. I had my rifle ready, my flashlight by my side, and a thermos of lukewarm coffee to keep me awake. Around midnight, I saw movement in the distance again. 2 figures, walking side by side, slowly making their way toward the outpost. I tried to track them with my scope, but they seemed wrong. Their movements were too smooth, too deliberate, almost mechanical. I called Jackson over on the radio, whispering, and he told me to stay put and observe. They stopped at the tree line, then turned in a direction that didn't make sense. Instead of heading toward the base, they moved in circles, almost like they were pacing some invisible boundary. Then, without warning, one of them vanished. I tracked the second one for a few moments, but it disappeared too. No footprints, no tracks, nothing in the snow to indicate where they had gone. I tried to sleep during the day, but the visions kept coming. Figures on the horizon, glimmers of movement in the distance, shadows that didn't align with ours. Eventually, It got to the point where even the most seasoned soldiers began questioning what was real. One of our guys, Thompson, said he saw someone standing at the edge of the outpost, watching him while he slept. We got up to confront them. There was nothing. The breaking point came during a routine patrol. I was part of a small team sent out to check sensors along a ridge a few kilometers from the outpost. Everything was fine until we reached the third sensor. It had been tripped, but the snow around it was completely undisturbed. No footprints, no drag marks, nothing. Then we saw it. A man, or what looked like a man, standing a few hundred meters away, perfectly still. He wore no discernible uniform, and the wind seemed to flow around him instead of disturbing him. We called out, but he didn't move. We approached slowly, but the closer we got, the further away he seemed. It was impossible, physically impossible. Yet there he was, retreating as we advanced, always keeping the same distance. We returned to the outpost shaken, but no one else had seen anything. The higher-ups dismissed our report as overactive imaginations and fatigue, but it didn't matter. The experiences escalated. Soldiers began refusing to go on patrols. A few even requested transfers, claiming they couldn't handle it. Some started sleeping in pairs, refusing to stay alone. One night, I woke to find the observation tower empty. The logs indicated I had never left my post, but when I checked the ground, there were no tracks leading up or away from the tower. Nothing to explain how I, or anyone else, had disappeared from my own post. That night, several soldiers went missing. Morning came, and we searched the snow, but no trace was found. No footprints, no tracks, no evidence. Just the same oppressive cold, the endless white, and the creeping feeling that we were being watched by something beyond comprehension. I requested an immediate transfer after that. I didn't care about protocol, rank, or consequences. I left as soon as the paperwork went through. The remaining soldiers eventually abandoned the outpost. The army officially closed it months later, citing budget constraints and logistical challenges. They never mentioned what happened to those of us who left, or those who vanished. I didn't realize how quickly fear could settle over you until I arrived at Kala-Nur, a small village in eastern Afghanistan, during the summer of 2013. My unit was tasked with a routine patrol to assess the security situation after reports of insurgent movement in the surrounding valleys. On paper, it was straightforward. Check in with local leaders, verify the villagers' needs, report any anomalies, and leave. But as soon as our convoy crested the final ridge leading into the valley, something felt off. The village appeared abandoned from a distance. Smoke rose lazily from a few chimneys, but there were no children playing, no livestock wandering, no men walking the narrow dirt paths. Just a few tattered flags flapping in the wind. I mentioned it to our squad leader, Captain Alvarez, and he shrugged it off. Probably everyone's working in the fields, he said, but even he didn't sound convinced. We drove into the village and stopped in the main square. The streets were eerily quiet, and the few houses that had people around showed signs of hasty departures. Meals left on tables, doors swinging open, blankets draped as if someone had just stepped out. The silence was oppressive, and even the wind seemed muted. We split into teams to check the houses. I was with Sergeant Malik and 2 other soldiers. The interiors were unsettling. Every house we entered looked like it had been frozen in time. Cooking pots were still on stoves, teacups on tables, shoes lined up by doorways. Nothing had been looted. Nothing was disturbed. It was as if the villagers had simply vanished. As we moved deeper into the village, I started noticing signs of a struggle, or maybe fear. Handprints smeared in dust, walls scratched with frantic lines, doors barricaded from the inside. In one home, I found a child's drawing on the wall, stick figures standing in a line, all facing a larger, darker figure drawn with heavy, jagged lines. I didn't show it to anyone. I just photographed it and moved on. We regrouped near the central well, and Captain Alvarez called it in. The village appeared abandoned, no contact with locals, no signs of insurgents. He ordered us to stay alert, but nothing in the briefings had prepared me for the atmosphere. The sun beat down, yet it felt like the shadows themselves were watching. Later that afternoon, we heard something, a faint noise, almost like whispers coming from the far side of the village. We followed it cautiously, rifles ready. But when we rounded the corner, nothing was there, just empty streets. That's when I saw the first one. A man, or what looked like a man, standing in the doorway of a crumbling building. His clothes were ragged, his eyes hollow, and he didn't move. He just stared. I called out to him, but there was no response. When we approached, he stepped back into the shadow of the doorway and disappeared. No tracks, no footprints, nothing. The unease spread quickly among the squad. Soldiers whispered about figures glimpsed in windows, shadows darting at the edge of sight, and the sensation that the village itself was watching. Captain Alvarez tried to maintain discipline, but even he seemed unsettled. That night, we set up camp in the village square, keeping a perimeter around the square's edges. The silence was heavier at night. Even the crickets seemed absent. Around midnight, I woke to movement. I thought it was one of the soldiers, but the shape wasn't right. It moved differently, sliding almost silently, stopping at the edge of our perimeter before disappearing. I woke Malik and pointed it out. He didn't argue. Instead, we stayed on high alert, scanning every doorway and alley with our flashlights and scopes. By morning, things escalated. Some of the soldiers reported seeing children walking through the streets, only to vanish when approached. Others described men standing at the edge of fields, wearing clothing decades out of style, with eyes that seemed to follow you no matter where you went. We found signs of recent activity in abandoned homes, bowls of food, freshly cleaned floors, footprints leading in circles. We decided to investigate further, splitting into smaller teams to search the outskirts. I was with Captain Alvarez and two others. On the far side of the village, we discovered a small cemetery. Most of the graves were old, but one had been dug recently. Inside, we found nothing, just an empty hole with soil freshly turned. That was when I felt it, a presence pressing down, like the air itself had weight. I turned and saw dozens of figures lining the tree line. They weren't moving, but they were there, watching, waiting. We called it in immediately. The command ordered extraction. By the time the helicopters arrived, the village seemed almost normal again. Dust swirled in the wind. Doors that had been open were closed, and for a moment, it looked like nothing had ever happened. We left quickly, but the memory of the empty streets, the disappearing figures, and the hollow eyes of the man in the doorway stayed with me. Even now, years later, I can't forget Kalainer. I was assigned to a special reconnaissance unit in Germany. The mission seemed straightforward at first. NATO intelligence had identified a series of old Cold War-era bunkers scattered across the eastern border, some of which were rumored to have been abandoned for decades. My squad's task was to inspect one particular site, a bunker in the Bavarian forest that had been marked as structurally stable but long unused. The orders were simple: gather information, document any structural damage, and report anomalies. Nothing about the mission indicated it would be anything more than a routine inspection. We drove hours through narrow roads lined with dense trees before reaching the site. The bunker was partially concealed by overgrowth, its concrete walls streaked with decades of moss and rain. Approaching it, the air felt heavier, though I chalked that up to the humidity and the weight of my gear. My squad leader, Sergeant Klein, briefed us quickly. "Check everything. Keep comms on. No wandering off alone. We're only here for documentation." Inside, the bunker was larger than I expected. Corridors stretched into darkness, branching into rooms filled with old equipment, rusted metal shelving, and paperwork long left to decay. We began our inspection, photographing the rooms, logging serial numbers, and noting the general state of disrepair. Most of the bunker was empty, but there were odd remnants scattered about: old mess kits, a few personal items, and files with faded writing in German. The strange part came when we reached the lower levels. There was a narrow staircase descending further than the maps indicated. Klein ordered two of us, myself included, to go down and document the area. The air grew colder the further we descended, and it smelled like damp concrete mixed with something metallic. When we reached the bottom, we found a large room with banked bunks and what looked like a command center. Computers were old and stripped, but paper logs were still stacked on the desks. That's when I noticed the handwriting in the logs. Recent entries, weeks old, not decades. The dates were from last month. I froze. Klein came down behind me and leaned over. "That can't be," he muttered. The logs detailed movements and daily routines of soldiers we didn't know existed, names we had never heard of. The entries were meticulous, but none matched any records in NATO or local archives. We radioed the others to come down and verify. When they arrived, they too saw the logs and the signs of recent activity. A few soldiers joked nervously about some trespassers or survivalists using the bunker, but the idea didn't fit. It was deep underground, with access points that were sealed or heavily overgrown. No one could have been living there without us knowing. Over the next few hours, we explored every accessible corridor. The deeper we went, the stranger it became. There were rooms that appeared untouched for decades, yet the bunk beds were made, floors swept, and even a small stove was lit. Nothing else explained how it could have been in use. Klein began keeping strict formations, ordering us to stay together and maintain line of sight. Then we found the first body. It was in a storage room, partially hidden beneath rusted shelving. At first glance, it looked like a skeleton, but closer inspection revealed flesh, desiccated, preserved by the cold and lack of ventilation. We called in for extraction immediately. The body had been wearing a uniform unlike any standard issue we recognized, and in its hand was a notebook filled with handwriting almost identical to the logs we had found earlier. That night, we set up a perimeter inside the bunker, waiting for extraction. I took the first watch. While scanning the corridors, I thought I heard footsteps coming from deeper within the bunker. I called out, but only silence answered. When the extraction team arrived the next morning, they were baffled by our story. They confirmed the bunker had been abandoned since the late 1980s, and yet we had photographic evidence of made beds, food containers, and the body. We returned to the base, debriefed, and turned over the logs and photographs. No official explanation was given. Higher-ups simply instructed us to mark the site as hazardous and move on. The incident never made it into public reports. A few of us requested leave afterward, citing stress and the feeling that the place shouldn't have been touched. I can't explain what we saw. To this day, I replay it in my mind. The rooms that were used but not supposed to be. The body in a uniform that didn't exist. The logs of soldiers who were never in any records. I don't know if it was some secret experiment left over from the Cold War, or if something else entirely inhabited that bunker. Something that watched, waited, and kept meticulous notes. I avoid thinking about it, but certain nights, when I close my eyes, I see those corridors stretching endlessly beneath the earth. I hear the faint scratching of papers being moved, footsteps echoing in empty halls, and the weight of eyes watching from rooms that should have been empty for decades. I don't know what we disturbed, but I know we weren't meant to see it.